he produced a file and maniacally went to work trying to saw the staff in half. As for the orb, well, Parrot had stashed it inside of his own pants. Hi everyone, it's Margot here with another episode of Crown and Kingdom. When we think of the royal family, we often have images in our minds of crowns, tiaras, and scepters, or arrest warrants, depending on who you're imagining. Their large collection of finery, plate, gemstones, swords, crowns, and more are all referred to as the crown jewels and are famous throughout the world. These most precious items have been under strict surveillance and security for centuries, and it would seem almost impossible for anyone to consider attempting to steal these most valuable of goods. But that didn't stop one man from giving it his best shot in what has been described as the most daring theft to ever take place in England, and his crime has spawned numerous conspiracy theories that are still being discussed today. This is the story of the theft of the crown jewels. In the aftermath of the English Civil War and the execution of King Charles I in 1649, and check out my video of his downfall and death for more information on that topic, Oliver Cromwell ordered the destruction of the crown jewels, declaring that the items represented, quote, the detestable rule of kings. Although the clerk of the jewel house did his best to protect them, the parliamentarian forces won out, and with the exception of 3 swords, an ampulla, and the coronation spoon, the entire crown jewel collection was melted down, sold, or defaced. A puritanical aesthetic was then imposed upon the country, which would last for over the next decade. But in 1660, the monarchy was restored when my spiritual husband, King Charles II, arrived in England to claim his birthright. Keen to resurrect the idea of monarchy and show his legitimacy, wealth, and power, Charles made the decision to recreate the crown jewel collection. Although his pockets were small, Charles was determined to bring back royal pomp and ceremony, the likes of which were unknown to many after the short, dark period of the Commonwealth. The new king commissioned the recreation of a number of items, including 2 crowns, 2 scepters, an orb, spurs, and bracelets. But these would not come cheaply. After living in a state of exile in Europe for years, Charles was forced to spend government funds, take out loans, and even borrow some of the materials needed to recreate this incredible collection. Banker and royal goldsmith Sir Robert Viner was charged with recreating the destroyed pieces, and records show the king spent upwards of £30,000 for the manufacturing of his new regalia, as well as a large amount, about 2,300 kilograms or 5,000 pounds worth, of gold plate. For your reference, that converts to about £3.5 million today. His new state crown alone featured hundreds of diamonds, pearls, an aquamarine, and the famous Black Prince's ruby. The public response to the spending of this money was mixed. Some welcomed the return of royal pomp and splendor after the austere years under the rule of the Commonwealth. But on the other side of a decade-long civil war, where many lost their jobs, homes, properties, and even loved ones, some felt this ostentatious display of wealth was adding insult to injury. Noted diarist Samuel Pepys referred to Charles's new court as one filled with, quote, lewdness and beggary. I hasten to add, this didn't stop Samuel from spending all of his time there, creeping on the king's favorite mistress, but that's a tale for another video. Regardless of public opinion, the new jewels were created, And after the new king's coronation, which was delayed in order to remake all this regalia, the new crown jewels were placed under lock and key until 1669, when they were first put on display for the public. The crown, orb, scepter, and numerous other items of the regalia were moved to what was known as the Jewel House, but today is called the Martin Tower, inside the Tower of London. The collection was kept in a recess, carved into the stone of one of the tower walls, barricaded in by an iron grille on a hinge. This important collection was overseen by the keeper of the crown jewels, 76-year-old Talbot Edwards. Edwards and his family actually lived in the Martin Tower, in rooms above the space where the regalia was kept. He was a father of 2, and while his son was away in the army, his daughter Elizabeth lived with her parents in the tower. A former soldier on a tight budget, Edwards sought, and was granted, permission to allow visitors to view the jewel collection for a small fee to supplement his income. Having shown the collection to various visitors throughout the years, he had no reason to suspect anything was amiss when, in April of 1671, an elderly parson and his aged wife arrived at the tower, requesting to see the jewels. Having introduced themselves as Parson Blood and Mrs. Blood, the couple were warmly welcomed by Edwards, and were quickly taken to see the collection. Once inside the Martin Tower, the couple marveled at the regalia, and Mrs. Blood was so impressed by the sight that she actually became suddenly faint. Edwards called for his wife, who invited Mrs. Blood up to the family's apartment to lie down and drink a glass of cordial. She soon felt well again, as do I after a glass of wine and a nap, so the couple decided to depart. Both Parson Blood and his wife thanked the Edwards for their, quote, civility, and expressed their sincerest gratitude for the hospitality and help. Then they took their leave. But what Edwards and his wife didn't know is that the elderly parson was actually a 53-year-old ex-magistrate by the name of Thomas Blood, whose real wife was ill at home in Lancashire. The woman accompanying Thomas was an actress, and, by all accounts, a very good one, called Jenny Blaine. The Edwards were also unaware that this would not be the last they would see of the so-called Parson Blood. Thomas Blood, sometimes known as Colonel Blood, although he apparently gave that title to himself, and a move that I honestly kind of like, was an Anglo-Irish army officer, described by a contemporary as a, quote, notorious desperado, which I also kind of like, but I have very poor taste in men. Anyway, Thomas came from a respectable family. His grandfather was an MP, and his father was a successful land-owning blacksmith. Thomas himself had been a magistrate before taking up arms at the outbreak of the English Civil War in 1642. Initially, he fought on the side of the Royalists, but, with a knack to always spot an opportunity, he switched allegiance to the Parliamentarians and fought with Cromwell's Roundheads, successfully backing the winning side. As a reward for his good service, Cromwell granted Thomas confiscated Royalist lands and appointed him a justice of the peace. All was well and good for him, until the monarchy was restored in 1660 under the reign of King Charles II, who quickly passed the Act of Settlement, annulling many of the land grants given to Cromwellian supporters like Thomas that had been issued after the end of the Civil War. Having had, quote, his land stolen, an embittered, penniless, and revengeful Thomas returned home to Ireland. He quickly set about contacting other former Roundheads in similar situations in an attempt to organize an insurrection in Ireland in 1663. His plan was to storm Dublin Castle, kidnap the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the Duke of Ormond, and usurp the government. The plot was foiled, and Blood, now a wanted man, fled to the Dutch Republic, although a number of his co-conspirators were arrested and executed. Not one to give up, however, and swearing vengeance for the execution of his compatriots, Blood returned to England in 1670. He posed as a doctor, reportedly even practicing medicine, in Romford, with the goal of taking another shot at the Duke of Ormond, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Blood and a number of like-minded individuals set out to murder the Duke and have their revenge. Ormond was attacked and abducted while traveling in his coach along St. James's Street near Piccadilly. The Duke was bound, thrown on horseback, and taken by the gang toward Tyburn, where his abductors planned to hang him and leave his body in the street. One of the kidnappers even pinned a note to the Duke's shirt, explaining why he was to be murdered, so when his body was found the next day, their message would be received. The Duke of Ormond, however, did not go quietly, and managed to overpower the horseman he was bound to, and, with the help of a servant who had given the kidnappers chase, was able to escape. Word of the attempted assassination quickly spread, and a reward was offered for the capture of the culprits. But the secrecy of the plot meant Blood's name was not associated with the crime, although he was still a wanted man owing to his first attempt on the Duke's life years before. Denied satisfaction twice over, Blood decided to switch tactics and hatched one of the most audacious crimes the country would ever see. 6 months later, Thomas found himself dressed as a parson, arm in arm with a woman pretending to be his wife, as they stepped foot into the Tower of London and came face to face with Talbot Edwards. A few days after Parson Blood and his so-called wife visited the Martin Tower, where, you'll recall, his wife was taken suddenly ill, Blood returned to the Tower of London. He had brought with him 4 pairs of very fine gloves for Mrs. Edwards, as a thank you for her kindness and generosity when his wife had her near-fainting spell on their previous visit. Talbot and his wife were touched by the gesture, and insisted the parson stay to relax a little, and, thus, a friendship between the 3 of them was born. Blood's visits became routine, and on one such get-together he made a great fuss of the keeper's daughter, Elizabeth Edwards. He praised her beauty, stating she would make an excellent bride for any young man. Blood then made sure to make a semi-offhanded comment about a nephew of his who had an income of about £200 or £300 a year. His hit landed, and soon Blood and Elizabeth's parents were in deep, excited discussion about an engagement between the two. As for what Elizabeth herself thought of any of this, or if she was even asked for her opinion, we can but only guess. It was then decided that Parson Blood should return to the Tower on the 9th of May and bring his nephew along so the prospective newlyweds could meet one another. Now, I've had rough blind dates in the past, but what happened next to Elizabeth and her family really takes the cake. As arranged, Blood came to the Tower on the morning of the 9th, and was greeted by the very excited Talbot Edwards. On this visit, Blood was joined by his, quote, nephew, and 2 other unexpected guests. Thomas told Edwards that he had brought his two friends along, as they would very much like to see the crown jewels for themselves. In reality, the three men with blood were Robert Perrott, Richard Hallowell, and a third man, identified with varying names in different reports, perhaps called Smith or Hunt. Of course, all three were in on Blood's plan. The men were all dressed well, in cloaks that concealed the weapons and tools they had armed themselves with. Richard Hallowell offered to stay behind, ostensibly to await Parson Blood's wife, who was, quote, running late, but in reality he was to act as lookout for the other men. Edwards agreed to the parson's request and led the visitors into the Tower of London and toward the Martin Tower. With no clue, he was about to become a victim of an audacious and vicious plot. One has to wonder if Elizabeth Edwards, dressed in her finest, was eagerly watching this all taking place, looking out her window and guessing which of these men was to be her potential fiancé. Luckily for her, although she wouldn't have been aware of this at the time, none of them would ever fill that role. As soon as Edwards made it to the steps of the Martin Tower, the three accompanying men attacked him. They were well prepared, armed with weaponry and tools for this specific purpose. A gag, described as, quote, a great plug of wood, with a small hole in the middle to take breath at, was shoved into his mouth. His hands were bound, and a cloak was placed over his head. As he fought against his attackers, he was told they would not hesitate to kill him if he didn't cooperate. That didn't frighten Edwards, who realized very quickly the magnitude of the crime that was about to take place. But when he tried to fight back, he was struck with a mallet. Even that didn't quell his struggle, and he continued to fight and attempted to make noise to alert anybody about what was happening in the Martin Tower. For his refusal to sit silently by as the jewels were stolen, he was stabbed in the belly, and finally fell silent and still. The three men easily opened the metal grill protecting the jewels, and quickly, and specifically, pulled out the imperial state crown, the scepter with cross, and the sovereign's orb. Blood, still in his parson's attire, was in charge of the crown, and used the mallet that Edwards had been attacked with to smash the crown in order to properly conceal it within his cassock. A number of jewels were knocked loose from their settings by the smashing, so Blood scooped them up and shoved them into his pockets. One of the men was charged with the abduction of the scepter. Despite the fact he had brought a bag in which to carry it, he was shocked to find out that it was much longer than he had anticipated, and would be very difficult to conceal. So he produced a file and maniacally went to work trying to saw the staff in half. As for the orb, well, Perrott had stashed it inside of his own pants. With Edwards prone on the floor and the stolen items as concealed as possible, the men made their exit. But, as luck would have it, at the same time as the gang were departing the Martin Tower, Talbot Edwards' son, Wythe, was, unexpectedly and fortuitously, arriving at the Tower of London with a friend, a Captain Beckman, on a surprise trip home from army leave. And what a welcome home he was about to receive. The order of the following events has been slightly jumbled over time, but the rough series of scenes is as follows. The man keeping lookout at the gates attempted to stop Wythe from entering the tower, but he and his friend pushed past him to go to the family home within the Martin Tower. Around this time, Talbot Edwards, still alive despite a mallet to the head and a stab wound to the belly, managed to get the gag out of his mouth and shout, "Treason! "Murder! The crown is stolen!" Wythe managed to get a glimpse of his father on the floor of the Martin Tower, kneeling in a pool of his own blood, and then immediately gave chase, spying the three culprits running toward the southern exit of the tower complex. The thieves had initially planned to casually walk out of the tower so as not to arouse suspicion. But once they realized the young Edwards was onto them, they began to run as quickly as possible. Which begs the question, how fast can you run with the sovereign's orb down your pants? A yeoman on guard at the gateway, hearing the commotion and seeing a gang of men running towards him, attempted to stop the thieves. The guard had only a halberd and aimed it at the men, but Blood drew a concealed pistol and shot at the guard. Although he missed, the guard scrambled to get out of their way. There are reports that a second sentry had seen this go down, and, knowing Blood had a gun and was not afraid to use it, he quickly stepped aside as the men came past. Rumors apparently spread afterwards that he had been bribed to do so. Now out of the tower complex, and reunited with their lookout, the four men began to push their way along the crowded tower wharf. It was swamped with people going about their daily business, and the men shoved their way through, attempting to get to their horses. And, for a few moments, they must have thought they were truly about to get away with it. By now, guards at the tower were shouting, "Stop! Thief!" Wythe's friend Beckman then came bursting from the tower and managed to grab Blood as he was climbing into the stirrups of his horse. Beckman attempted to wrestle the crown away from Blood, who shot at him, but, again, missed. This commotion drew members of the public to aid, and soon, vastly outnumbered, the four conspirators were overpowered. Apparently, in the melee, described by an eyewitness as, quote, a robustious struggle, even more gems came loose from the crown, including the precious Black Prince's ruby, still in place on the imperial state crown today. As the gems scattered, many were found by members of the public, and, if you can believe it, all returned to the tower. Be honest, if you were a young worker down on your luck who happened to come across diamonds and gold lying in the cobbles outside the tower in the midst of all this rabble, would you have handed them back? Our decisions notwithstanding, it was noted that, with all the jewels returned, the damaged items could eventually be restored. As he was taken into custody, Blood reportedly shouted, quote, "It was a gallant attempt, however unsuccessful. It was for a crown." One report claims that it was at this point that Blood's disguise as a parson was finally removed, and the seemingly elderly clergyman was revealed to in fact be a, quote, beardless, tall, rough-boned man with small legs, a pock-frecken face, with little hollow blue eyes, and facial features that were, quote, daring, villainous, and unmerciful. This sounds too much like an episode of Scooby-Doo for me, but perhaps there is some truth in it. There are varying reports about what happened to the other conspirators. Some say one of the men was identified as an accomplice in the attempted murder of the Duke of Ormond and was thrown into jail. Some say two of the men successfully fled the scene. Others say all of them were apprehended and put into the dungeons. Regardless of what happened to the other three, we know exactly what happened to Colonel Blood. Blood was immediately apprehended, and the general consensus was that he was going to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, considering not only his attempt at treason by stealing the crown jewels, but his previous crimes as well. However, once he was taken into custody, Blood refused to answer any questions, repeatedly stating, quote, "I'll answer to none but the king himself." Apparently, the king was informed of this and agreed to grant an audience, wanting to meet this semi-famous and audacious rogue. One account actually states that, on being told of the attempt to steal the jewels, Charles actually roared with laughter and asked to meet the man who had attempted it. In either case, Blood, in chains, was taken to see the king at the Palace of Whitehall, but once in front of him, some reports tell us that Blood demanded a private audience. You can just imagine the looks on the faces of the king's personal security as, bizarrely, Charles agreed to this request and asked everybody to leave the room. The story goes that the king asked Blood, quote, "What if I should give you your life?" and that the self-appointed colonel replied, quote, "I would endeavor to deserve it." Another account states that Blood's defense of his crime was that the crown jewels weren't actually worth that much money. I mean, considering he had smashed the crown with a hammer, had the scepter sawn in half, and the sovereign's orb had been traveling about in a criminal's pants, he was probably right at that point. That account states that Charles was incredibly amused by Blood's defense. Whether any of these accounts are true or not, what we do know is that Blood was immediately pardoned. Not only that, but his lands that had been taken from him on the return of the monarchy were given back, as well as a pension of £500 a year and an invitation to come to court. His official pardon, given on the 1st of August, 1671, reads thusly: "Pardon to Thomas Blood, the father of all treasons, misprisons of treason, murders, homicides, felonies, assaults, batteries, and other offences whatsoever, at any time since the 29th day of May, 1660, committed by himself alone or together with any other person or persons with the usual clauses. August 1st, 1671. In contrast to this, Talbot Edwards, who nearly lost his life in his attempt to protect the crown jewels, was awarded £300 for his bravery, a sum that was never paid in full, despite the fact that Edwards retook his post as keeper of the jewels. He died around 3 years later and was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London. After his pardon, Blood became a familiar face at court, also becoming a popular dinner party guest, an actual celebrity criminal who regaled people with tales of his dastardly crimes and narrow escapes. An acquaintance reported seeing Blood, quote, "strutting about on Tower Green shortly after his pardon, dressed in an expensive new suit and a fancy periwig." This was all to the disgust of the Duke of Ormond, obviously, and noted figures like John Evelyn, who was horrified upon arriving at a party and finding Blood as an attendant. Evelyn stated he could, quote, "never come to understand how Blood had not only gotten away with his crime, but was seemingly rewarded for it." Noted poet and courtier John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, wrote and published this verse about Blood: "Blood that wears treason in his face, villain complete in parson's gown, how much he is at court in grace, for stealing Ormond and the crown. Since loyalty does no man good, let's steal the king and outdo Blood." The final line implies that loyalty to the king doesn't pay, so one may as well attempt crimes that would rival those of Blood. Sounds logical to me. Blood enjoyed his celebrity through the years, until, in 1679, he was sued for £10,000 by the Duke of Buckingham for making insulting remarks about the Duke's character. Despite the king's feelings toward Blood, he couldn't escape a court twice and was convicted of slander by the king's bench. He was granted bail, never paid the damages, and died not long after in July of 1680. So slippery was Blood's character, and so well known was his reputation for fakery, that his body was exhumed by the authorities just to confirm that he was actually dead, and not just pretending to get out of paying his reparations to Buckingham. The words on his epitaph were rough, but fair. "Here lies the man who boldly hath run through more villainies than England ever knew, and ne'er to any friend he had was true. Here let him then by all unpitied lie, and let's rejoice his time was come to die." Now, if the king's response to Blood and his crimes sounds odd to you, you're not alone. It certainly did so to everybody else at the time. So now, let's put on our tinfoil hats and look at some conspiracy theories that may explain the king's odd behavior toward the man who attempted to storm Dublin Castle, kidnap and murder the Duke of Ormond twice, and steal the new crown jewels, attempting to kill the keeper in the process. Some ascribed Charles's lenience toward Blood to his amusement, saying the king was simply taken in by the colonel's outrageous charm and impudence. Others say Blood's exemption was a symbol of the king's relaxed style of rule, or that Charles was simply just incredibly impressed by Blood's daring and his claim that the jewels weren't actually worth that much money. There's even a school of thought that perhaps Charles feared an uprising by Blood's followers if he were to be punished. There's even one theory that states Blood had told the king that he had once had an opportunity to murder him years before. Blood claimed he had come upon the king bathing in the Thames, but was so in, quote, awe of his majesty that he could not bring himself to do it. If this were the case, I'd like to know just exactly how majestic Charles looked while floating around naked in the Thames. For research purposes only, of course. But some take a more cynical view, with theories that I find more likely. One theory states that having spent time in the Dutch Republic, Blood had strong connections there. With the threat of a third Anglo-Dutch war on the horizon, it suggested that the king's spymaster, the Earl of Arlington, sought to turn Blood into a double agent. It's difficult to imagine that Blood, however lucky or charismatic he was, didn't assume he would be put to death for his crime against the crown. So, an opportunity to spy for the king in exchange for his freedom would have made quite a tempting offer. John Evelyn, who I mentioned before, wrote in his diary that he believed Blood's position as a spy was the only thing that could explain his place in the king's favor. And other rumors began to swirl around court, all of which put the king himself at the heart of the theft. One popular story was that, while drunk, not an unusual state to find him in, I'll add, the king had laid a bet that the crown jewels would be stolen, and then put Blood up to the task to win his wager, although that, perhaps, is not as likely as the following theories. Remember, I told you that the king spent exorbitant amounts of money on the new crown jewel collection, even borrowing gemstones and cash where he could to bring his recreations to fruition. This left him with very little cash, and some theorized that it was actually Charles himself who was behind the whole affair, having hired Blood to steal the jewels and then sell them for ready money, potentially even offering to split the proceeds with the thief. There were also some who believed the theft of the crown jewels was, weirdly, a PR move by the king. You'll recall that I mentioned some members of the public weren't thrilled with Charles's expense to create the new crown jewel collection. However, when word of Blood's theft reached the public, there was large outrage. People couldn't believe that somebody would be so bold, so villainous, and so treasonous as to attempt to steal the crown jewels, treasures that were partially paid for by the public and were considered items of the utmost importance in the country. Could it be that the attempt to steal the jewels was actually a way to change the public's perception of the items and lessen the ire of those who had been put out by the exorbitant cost of their creation? Or was it indeed a ploy to free up funds for the cash-strapped king? Did the king find use for Blood's connections and turn him into a royalist spy? Or was Charles just that impressed by Blood's daring and charisma? Or did the king really just look that good naked? Whatever the truth, today the crown jewels remain safely in the jewel house at the Tower of London, still on display to the public, and no other attempt has ever been made to steal these most precious of items. But the story of Thomas Blood has gone down in history as one of the most audacious crimes England has ever seen. And it would seem, even today, some people are still taking a page out of his playbook. And so ends the tale of Colonel Blood and the theft, or not, of the crown jewels. Which explanation do you think is most likely? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you to King Charles II for laying the foundations of the incredible crown jewel collection that we have today. To Thomas Blood for carrying out a scheme so wild we're still talking about it 300 years later. And of course, thanks to you for watching. I'm Margot Moore, wishing you goodbye and good times.